You might have heard some bodybuilders and fitness competitors doing this carb loading. They drastically increase their carbohydrate intake for certain days to fill themselves up with carbs.
It's carbo loading.
Some people have been asking what do I think about carb loading with zero carbs by eating a bunch of protein. Can it work? How does it happen? And is it any good? Check out this video. So why do people carb load in the first place? During high intensity exercise such as lifting weights, HIIT, sprinting, or anything anaerobic, you require glycogen. Glycogen is stored glucose that gets deposited in liver and muscle cells. The body uses primarily fatty acids during low intensity movement and spares glycogen for high intensity endeavors. Generally, the crossover effect wherein you shift fuel sources occurs around 65% of your maximum heart rate. The idea of carb loading is that if you deplete your muscle glycogen during high intensity exercise and then you follow it up by eating a bunch of carbohydrates, then you're gonna help to replenish glycogen faster and you create this super compensation effect. If you get it right, then you can refill your glycogen, which will then increase your performance, increases muscle recovery, muscle growth, increases metabolic rate, nitric oxide, and thyroid functioning as well. Carb loading too heavily or doing it at the wrong time where your body doesn't need that extra glycogen can have the opposite effect, causing overspilling, fat gain, water retention, bloating, fatigue, and prolonged blood sugar levels, which will increase inflammation and insulin production.
Time to carbo load.
Carbohydrate-rich foods like rice, potatoes, grains, vegetables, fruits, and sweets consist of primarily glucose and sugar, which can directly be deposited as glycogen. However, there are other fuel substrates that can also end up as stored glycogen through certain metabolic pathways. Fatty acids, amino acids, and protein can also be converted into glucose through the process of gluconeogenesis, which means the creation of new glucose. Yes, on paper you can refill your glycogen and carb load by eating more protein than is needed for maintaining your body's nitrogen balance. The same can happen with extra fats and not eating anything at all as well, which we'll be talking about in the rest of this video.
Possibly.
Protein is the only macronutrient that can't be stored inside the body long term. Increased protein intake will elevate muscle protein synthesis and activates the mTOR pathway, which will help to build or maintain lean muscle mass. To activate these anabolic pathways, you need only a certain amount of protein, and more won't have a dose increasing effect. More protein won't make you build exponentially more muscle. Current research has shown that this limit is somewhere around 0.7 to 1.0 grams per pound of lean body mass. There are some amino acid pools that can hold onto nitrogen and proteins temporarily, but you can't really store protein inside the body beyond a certain point. To store protein as energy, it has to be converted into glucose through gluconeogenesis first. The process of breaking down glucose is called glycolysis, which produces pyruvate, an energy molecule that helps to produce ATP. Gluconeogenesis is the reverse of that. Gluconeogenesis may sound like a horror movie, and it definitely freaks out some people who are eating the ketogenic diet, but it's simply a process by which your body creates glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. Glucose can be created from gluconeogenic amino acids such as alanine, arginine, asparagine, cysteine, glutamine, methionine, histidine, tryptophan, and many others. Ketogenic amino acids like leucine and lysine can't promote gluconeogenesis, but will be directly degraded into acetyl-CoA, which is the precursor of ketone bodies. Gluconeogenesis happens primarily in the liver and to a lesser extent in the kidneys. Gluconeogenesis is vital for survival because it helps you to maintain stable blood sugar levels, avoid hypoglycemia, give energy to the brain, and produce glucose when you're doing high intensity exercise. When you're exercising at high intensity, your muscles break down glucose, which gets oxidized into pyruvate. This produces more lactate than the body can handle, causing a buildup of lactic acid in the muscles. That's why you feel the burn effect. After lactate is produced, it gets transported back to the liver, where it's converted back into pyruvate inside the Cori cycle. Pyruvate is then used to create glucose through gluconeogenesis. This is such a great example of how your body does such an amazing job at recycling all the energy it has. It also shows that your body needs much less exogenous carbohydrates than you think, because the body can create its own.
Yep.
Glycerol, which is the backbone of triglycerides, can also be converted into glucose. through gluconeogenesis. Triglycerides are the main components of body fat in the humans and other animals. Acetone, which is one of the main ketone bodies, can also be converted into glucose. Acetone, which gets converted into pyruvate, can lead to the synthesis of new glucose. Gluconeogenesis is mostly regulated by glucagon, which is a hormone that gets released by the pancreas when blood sugar levels fall. Insulin counteracts glucagon and thus inhibits gluconeogenesis as well. People who are doing the low-carb keto diet may have become so worried about eating protein because of fearing that it's gonna turn into glucose through gluconeogenesis. However, that's something to not really be worried about. Gluconeogenesis is mostly driven by demand, not supply, which means that the body starts producing glucose only when it feels the need to, if there's no alternative for glucose around. Certain organs like the heart and brain need a certain amount of glucose every day to maintain their functioning. When you're in ketosis, the demand for that glucose gets much lower because the majority of energy demands will be covered by ketone bodies. In that scenario, there's no demand for gluconeogenesis because the body is running efficiently on ketones. If you're not in ketosis and not keto adapted, then the body's glucose demands will stay the same. In that case, whenever you restrict carbohydrates or you're fasting, the demand for gluconeogenesis increases because the body isn't producing enough ketones to give an alternative fuel to glucose. Consuming gluconeogenic amino acids like glutamine and methionine don't increase gluconeogenesis by themselves. To effectively start converting dietary protein into glucose, you would have to be consuming a whole lot more protein than people think. Gluconeogenesis can only temporarily increase your blood sugar, depending on how much protein was consumed in that meal. This can also lower ketone bodies slightly, which doesn't really matter over the course of the grand scheme of things. If you're not diabetic, if you don't have cancer or epilepsy, then you don't really have to be worrying about staying in the therapeutic range of ketosis all the time either. In fact, it would be actually better for metabolic flexibility to simply kick yourself out of ketosis every once in a while and still burn some glucose.
Possibly.
So how much protein gets converted into glucose through gluconeogenesis? Research done in the last century predicted that about 50 to 60% of protein gets converted into glucose, which would mean that from a meal with 100 grams of protein, 50 grams of it will be used for muscle homeostasis and the other 50 grams will be turned into glucose. However, this doesn't apply to the protein you would need to maintain nitrogen balance. It is true that the extra protein you don't need will eventually end up as glucose, but the rate is much lower than you think. Gluconeogenesis of dietary protein would occur only a certain threshold limit beyond maintaining your lean body mass. Giving diabetics a meal with 2 grams of protein per kilogram doesn't significantly increase blood sugar levels after eating, despite the protein still being utilized. Having carbohydrates 1 gram per kilogram, on the other hand, raises blood sugar as expected. From my own personal experience, I can say that eating 1.5 grams up to 2 grams per pound of body weight in protein doesn't significantly affect my blood sugar almost at all. You may experience a slight increase in blood glucose, but it drops off after a few hours. In a state of sufficient insulin, the uptake of alanine by the liver is virtually zero, which decreases hepatic glucose production. Therefore, insulin reduces the need for gluconeogenesis. At the end of the day, if you're carb loading with protein, then you're not really carb loading zero carb, because you're going to be still producing glucose. That glucose will be stored as glycogen. The body doesn't really tell the difference where that glucose is coming from, as long as it gets utilized as glucose.
Not so fast.
Eating only protein isn't a free-for-all either, because extra protein can still eventually get stored as fat. If you eat more carbohydrates than your glycogen stores can handle, then those extra carbs will be stored as triglycerides in your body fat. Likewise, the extra protein that gets converted into glucose through gluconeogenesis can also be stored as fat eventually. It's gonna take a whole lot more calories to make it happen than eating straight up carbs, but it's still possible. Protein also has the highest thermic effect of food, meaning you'll waste more energy on the digestion of protein than any other macronutrient. The thermic effect of protein is about 20 to 30% Thermic effect of carbs is 5 to 10%, and the thermic effect of fat is 3 to 7%. Eating a higher protein diet can lead to spontaneous weight loss because you'll end up wasting some of that energy for protein digestion. Calories still matter to a certain extent, but what this thermic effect of food shows you is that those calories get expressed differently depending on the macronutrient ratios of the food and the overall metabolic status. High protein diets are said to be damaging to the kidneys, bone health. They accelerate aging and give you cancer, but in most cases those claims are somewhat over-exaggerated. Some people may simply react negatively to higher protein intake because of poor gut health, not enough digestive enzymes, or not simply having that high requirements for protein. It's not the quantity of protein that matters, but the quality of it and how much you end up absorbing.
Protein.
But what about the other fuel substrates? Can you carb load with fat? Increased MCT oil consumption can enhance gluconeogenesis via an increase of glutamic alanine transaminase. In rats who've been fasting for 24 hours, intracellular hydrolysis of triglycerides can directly contribute to the conversion of glycerol into glucose and indirectly stimulate gluconeogenesis by the effects of fatty acids. I'm not telling you that you should take an IV of MCT oil and fats, but it does come to show that the body will still produce the energy it needs, regardless of where it's coming from. Dietary fat intake can also contribute to glycogen resynthesis thanks to glycerol and acetone. Glycerol can contribute up to 21% of glucose production. However, for acetone and fatty acids to be successfully converted into glucose, insulin has to be suppressed. Insulin suppresses the production of enzymes that help to convert acetone into pyruvate. When insulin levels are low, you'll increase ketones, which will enable the conversion of fatty acids into glucose. Research on keto-adapted endurance athletes also shows that they can replenish muscle glycogen the same way as carb athletes would, with no difference in performance. Keto adaptation also preserves more glycogen during exercise, enabling the body to run on fatty acids even above the crossover effect. Carb loads can be useful for increasing your performance, but they're not mandatory. How much protein you end up consuming every day is going to depend on your level of activity, how much lean body mass you have, what kind of workouts you're doing, and what's your metabolic condition. What I recommend is to stick to the golden rule of staying somewhere between 0.7 to 1.2 grams per pound of lean body mass. To get the carb loading effect from protein, then you would have to eat up to 2 to 4 grams of protein per pound of body weight. But again, it's not entirely necessary. Eating more protein doesn't have any negative side effects in the short term, but it's not gonna have any significant benefit either. On some days, you may have these protein refeeds by having slightly more protein, but if you were to have them too consistently, then your body would become desensitized to the intake of protein. You would have to cycle on and off from it, of having some days with lower protein and some days with higher protein to maintain your sensitivity to it. Protein. In most cases, I would choose to have some days with a little bit of extra protein and on some other days a little bit of extra carbs. You don't need to carb load that heavily all the time to gain the performance enhancing boosts. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure you click the like, subscribe, notification bell as well. My name is Seem. Stay balanced, stay empowered.
Big race tomorrow. So we're carbo loading.